Okay. Thank you to everybody for joining once again. We are continuing our shiur on tefillah, and we just completed the section of the korbanot. The korbanot section in the Sidur typically ends with a passage of Braita known as Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Let me admit Saralea 1 second. And Rabbi Yishmael Omer is a famous Braita at the beginning of the section of a midrash called Torat Kohanim, which goes through many of the halachot of the korbanot and Beit HaMikdash. Now, the Braita of Rabbi Yishmael itself is really a list of 13 rules for how one would expound the words in the Torah, how somebody is going to use the words of the Torah in order to create drashot. So, just some housekeeping. We'll finish up with Rabbi Yishmael Omer before we open the Kaddish. The reason, as we mentioned in the previous weeks, why we chose Rabbi Yishmael Omer was because it's a Braita or a part of Talmud or a drasha. It completes the trifecta of having Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara. So after Birkat Torah, you want to say all three. Therefore, we add a section of Gemara, a section of a Braita, which is Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Now, why choose this one? Of all of the Braitot in Shas, of all of the Gemarot, you could have chose anything, any Gemara in Shas. So the best suggestion, although nobody makes the suggestion until the time of the tour, the best suggestion really is that Rabbi Yishmael Omer is the introduction to the Medrash about Korbanot. So it was chosen because it's ending the section of Korbanot. That's the most sensible. Other people have said, well, because it has the keys to the whole Torah, we put it in because it's quintessential to understanding the Torah. Those are both valid reasons, but I find the Torah's reason the most convincing. But if you open most modern Sidurim, right after Rabbi Yishmael Omer will have a Kaddish. And considerably, people today understand this Kaddish as being essential, or it's always been there. And you'll find the Sidurim giving all sorts of reasons why it's there. The truth is, it didn't actually start getting printed, to my knowledge, in Sidurim until the 1800s. And we don't have any evidence of people saying a Kaddish between Rabbi Yishmael Omer and Hodu until the 16th century. Meaning the whole innovation, the suggestion of doing it, was begun by the Mekubalim, like Rav Chaim Vital and Shar Kavanot brings this from the Arizal. The Seder Hayom or Moshe ben Mechir suggests saying it. He says they don't just suggest it; they really speak about it matter of factly. They say, "Well, people are noheg, people do this, right?" In the 16th century, they're saying, "Oh, and people do a kaddish between Rabbi Yishmael and Hodu." They don't say why; they just mention it. In the Shar Kavanot, he gives some kabbalistic reasons for it, but it's never mentioned in any manuscripts. It's never brought down in any of the halachic sources. It's not until the 1800s, the 19th century, that you find it in Sidurim. So my suspicion is that this was never a universal minhag. It was a popular minhag, but it wasn't universal. And many of the real OG Sidurim stuck to their guns and didn't put it here whatsoever. So this Kaddish itself isn't halachically perfect. It's not original. It doesn't actually belong here. However, the type of Kaddish that they chose is called the Kaddish d'Rabbanan. Now, famously, the Kaddish d'Rabbanan is the Kaddish said after learning. That doesn't mean a Kaddish which is only required d'Rabbanan rather than required midoraita, like one might think. No, it's only of rabbinic obligation rather than a Torah obligation. That's not what Kaddish d'Rabbanan means. Kaddish d'Rabbanan simply means it's the Kaddish that the rabbis would say, or it means the Kaddish that says al Rabbanan. It's one of those two meanings. That's the only meaning of the word Kaddish d'Rabbanan. So because we have Kaddish here, this is the first point in the Siddur where we encounter Kaddish. I thought it would be prudent to begin our studies on the Kaddish tonight. The Kaddish is a study which has seen a massive, exhaustive amount of research over the past 200 years. It's hard to exaggerate how much work has been done to explore and to reverse engineer the origins of the Kaddish. It's really there's been an incredible amount of work done to try to reverse engineer it. And the earliest history of it is actually very murky. Now, let's begin with the most obvious. In case somebody's watching this YouTube thing and you're not familiar with what Kaddish is, let's just back up. Kaddish is a Jewish prayer that Jewish people say in all different in all different situations. Sorry. I have to share my screen again because we had a little bug over there. It just crashed on us. Often the Kaddish is used in a situation where, oh, I know, I see. I'm sorry. I just figured out why it wasn't working. Often the Kaddish is used in prayer, right? It is also used by mourners. It is used in Kaddish Yatom. It is used after people learn, right? After they learn, they do a Kaddish Rabbanan. It is used to bridge things into tefillah. It's the Kaddish comes up in Jewish practice all the time. The fancy word for Kaddish, as is if you look in academic works, the fancy word for it would be a doxology. A doxology is really a liturgical expression of praise to God. It's just a fancy word for a unit of prayer, which is a praise to God. So Kaddish, as in its essence, what it is it's a responsive doxology which comes in steps. The leader of the congregation, when there are 10 people, begins, "May God's name be great and exalted." Everyone says Amen, and then in Aramaic, and then they continue. They continue throughout the entire doxology with a couple of amens. That's essentially what Kaddish is. If you're religious, you're probably laughing because you know this. This is like baked into you. You understand. You know, we it's almost a reflex. Hearing Kaddish makes Jews answer Amen. There's no way around it. But the origins of what Kaddish is, what its actual initial purpose was, what its original function was, is clouded in a tremendous amount of mystery. We don't know where it comes from. We don't know. We do not know where it comes from. We do not know exactly why it was first created. And therefore, much of what we're going to be doing tonight is trying to reverse engineer this this doxology in order to figure out who invented it, when it was invented, and why. So let's start with the very first. Sorry, I think people, whatever. Somebody here wanted someone here wanted quiet, and I lost mouse control. My mouse is back. My mouse is back. I'm sorry for anybody listening. This is just technical difficulties. Okay. Trying to share my screen here. Sorry. Here we go. Okay. So let's start with one of the most famous Gemaras in Shas. There's a Gemara at the end of Sotah, Daf Memtet Amud Aleph. The Gemara gets into discussion about how the world is getting worse and worse and worse. It brings different Pesukim. Wait, I'm sorry. If somebody's talking, I actually don't hear you because it's so loud here. So I can't actually hear anything anyone says because I don't have earphones. At least not tonight. My apologies. Okay, so the Gemara says the world is getting progressively worse and worse. There is a series of pesukim to say that kol yom merubak chala mechavero, every day is more cursed than the day before it. So the Gemara says, really? What is the world actually standing on if it's more cursed every day than the previous one? So the Gemara answers, Akadusha de Sidra, Vayehe Shmei Rabba de Agadita. Two things, Kedusha de Sidra and Yehe Shmei Rabba of the Agadita. Shneamar, as the Pasuk says, Eretz Efata Kmo Ofel Tzamavet V'lo Starim. That it's a land of darkness, like a land of shadowy death without any order. Hayesh Sidarim, if there were Sidarim, Tofia Me'ofel, we would appear from amidst the darkness. Meaning that two things, one called Kedusha de Sidra, the other thing is called the Yehe Shmei Rabbah of the Agadita. Those keep the world standing. Now, everyone assumes that when the Gemara says Yehe Shmei Rabbah of Agadita, it means the Kaddish that we know today. We don't know this for sure, but this is one of the earliest sources for a prayer, which we could consider Yehe Shmei Rabbah de Agadita. Now, we're going to leave Kedusha de Sidra aside for a second. The Kedusha de Sidra is most likely Uva L'Tzion. That's what we say, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh by Uva L'Tzion after a learning section. What's going to interest us tonight is Yehe Shmei Rabbah de Agadita. What is this? So what needs to be understood is that in the earliest times, let's say during the Temple era and before the Temple era, in the hundreds of years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, it was very commonplace for Jewish congregations to get together for Torah readings. And this was already so ancient that they ascribed it to Moshe Rabbeinu and Ezra HaSofer that we do Kriyat Torah 3 times a week. But there was also the minhag of doing sermons and doing a seder or parshita, where a person would get up, preach from the pulpit, and he would give over, let's say, a seder. He would give over a parasha, a perek, and he would expound upon it and give law and give teachings and expositions. So this was called by different names. Sometimes it was called the parshita, sometimes it was called the sidra. But even though they did this during the weekday, it was most commonly done on Shabbat because people weren't working. So they were able to go to synagogue and they were able to go study Torah. Now, this unit was usually divided into 3. There was first the pticha, right? The first part was the opening of the sermon. Then there was the sidra itself, the actual drasha, the drasha that the chacham was going to give. And lastly, there's something called the aftarta, right? The departing, the dismissal, when the rabbi would say something like parting words, so to speak. Now, the Gemara says that the parting words that a chacham is supposed to speak are supposed to be divrei tanchumin, consoling words. In other words, that they're supposed to hearken to the redemption. They're supposed to be messianic in nature. And therefore, till today, we see people have the minhag that when they end a speech, they say, "We should be zoicha to have bia skoil b'mehera b'meinu amen." This all comes from a Gemara in the Yerushalmi. It also comes from Gemara in the Bavli. It says, "Shekein matzinu b'neviim harishonim shesiemu divreihem b'divrei shvach v'tanchumim," that they would finish their words with divrei shvach and tanchumim. So the Aramaic word for tanchumim would be nechamata, like we say samchinan churbana l'churbana v'nechamata l'nechamata. The word for this type of this, technically it's called like a eulogy or aftarta or a dismissal, is a nechemata. Sometimes it's also called divrei nechamot. I just want to show you guys a few more gemarot that mention this. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my browser. I believe we have one. Oh, shoot. Let me see. Hold up. Oops. What just happened? Brachos. Get it? Looks like I didn't pick out any of those right now. But okay. My point is, this practice was called a nechamata, and it was very common. Now, I want to show you a few examples of nechamot that were written at the end of the sermon. One of the most famous ones, obviously, is Uva L'Tzion. Right? Uva L'Tzion Goel is technically a nechamata. If when you simply think about Uva L'Tzion, it's talking about Mashiach. It's talking about the end of days, and it's praising God's name at the end of days. Uva L'Tzion is one of the quintessential nechamata, divrei nechama. Another good example is the Yerushalmi in Brachot. It says, Reb Chia Barva Matzli, he would pray, Yiratzon lefanecha Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, shetitein b'libeinu la'asot teshuvah shleima lefanecha shlo nevosh me'avotenu l'olam haba. And Reb Yudan Ber Bishmal told his Meturgamon that you're going to end the sermon every day with this prayer. These are 2 easy examples of this. Furthermore, let me see if I can bring the other Gemarot. I'm going to share my screen here. The Gemara in Brachot says that a story with Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta. Now, mind you, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta lived in the 2nd century, between the years like 100 and 200. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta has this episode where he finds himself in a ruin in Yerushalayim, and Eliyahu HaNavi encounters him and says, "Why were you in that ruin?" And he says, he's doing a meditation where he basically was praying for the tzarot of Klal Yisrael. He was doing a meditation where he's praying for the Jewish people. And Eliyahu HaNavi says you shouldn't have gone into a ruin. Ruins are dangerous. What he means is don't do that type of meditation. And at the end of the day, he says, but Eliyahu HaNavi tells him, when you were in that meditation, when you were in that prayer, you were in this ruin, so to speak, of Yerushalayim. What did you hear? You heard a bat kol, didn't you? And he said, yes, I did. And we're going to read this together. says, Shamati bat kol shemenahemet kiona ve'omeret. I heard a bat kol chirping like a dove, and it said, Oili shachrafti et beiti v'sarafti et echali v'gliti et panai lebein omat olam. God is saying, woe unto me that I destroyed the Jewish temple and I exiled my people. V'amar li, and he said to me, Chayecha v'chaye roshcha. Eliyahu told Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, remember, somebody from the 2nd century. He said, Lo shazu bilvad, you didn't hear this once. This happens 3 times a day. V'lo zu bilvad, and not just that, שבשעה שישראל נכנסים לבתי כנסיות ובתי מדרשות ועונים יהי שמי הגדול מבורך, הקדוש ברוך הוא מנענע בראשו ואומר אשר ימל שמכלסין אותו בביתו כך. מה לא לאב שיגלה את בניו ואוי להם לבנים שגלו מעל שולחן אביהם. That 3 times a day, Hashem Kaddish Baruch Hu hears the Kaddish and he shakes his head that he had to, what's the word? Exile the Jewish people from their place. Another midrash you have in Kohelet Rabbah that extols the virtues of saying Kaddish. It says, even if a person has a degree of curse for 100 years, if a person says the Kaddish of the Agadatov, if after the Chacham says a shir and then they say Kaddish, this can destroy, if a person says Yehei Shmei Rabbah out loud, this can destroy a decree of curse even for 100 years. We see that it's inextricably linked in the time of Chazal. This idea of saying Yehei Shmei Hagadol Mevrach La'olam L'mei Maya is inextricably linked to the learning of the Sidra. So far, so good. We know that there's a type of prayer called a nechemata. It's kind of not a prayer, but it's kind of like a eulogy, an ending, a dismissal of the sermon. And they would, at the end of the sermons, they would say divrei nechamot, which were also called a nechemata. Kaddish itself is just one of the surviving nechamatot. It's one of the surviving nechamas that they would say at the end of a sermon. This is why in Kaddish we say le'elam mikol bechata shirata tushbechata v'nechemata. People read Kaddish and they're like, what's a nechemata? I know what a tushbechata is, shirata. I know what all those things are. But what is a nechemata? Everybody reads Kaddish and they're like, what is that? And there's so many pirushim, so many commentaries about what nechemata could possibly mean. But the truth is Kaddish is being reflexive. The Kaddish is speaking about itself. God is more praiseworthy than any nechama we could possibly say. Any one of these eulogy sermons, any one of these dismissal sermons we could possibly say, whether it's Ubal Etzion, whether it's Kaddish, whether it's the Hiratzon, whether it's whatever you're going to say, Hashem is greater than any of these praises. Again, the Kaddish itself in content is both a praise of God's great name and a hope for the future where we're going to have God's name be exalted even more with messianic hopes. That's the core of the Kaddish, and that's why it's called a nechemata. So that's what we know from the period of the Talmud. Now, give me a second to orient myself here. Now, the Talmud is very early, and if we're to believe the attribution of the Gemara that it attributes this story to Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, then we've moved this response of Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah, Amen Yehei Shmei Hagadol Mevarach much further back to the 2nd century. And typically the Gemara is a reliable source for this kind of history unless we have some textual error. So we've moved back that we know Kaddish definitely existed in the 2nd century. The question is, can we move Kaddish back even earlier? Perhaps did it exist even before the Churban? Maybe Kaddish is something that was invented by the Jewish people while the Beis HaMikdash was still standing. How do we know that it necessarily showed up all the way, let's say, in the time of the Gemara? So let me share my screen once more. Sorry. So one of the best pieces of research on the Kaddish was written by a rabbi named Rabbi David di Solapul. Rabbi David di Solapul was a Sephardi rabbi who was trained in London, and I think he was in Jews College and in Hebrew in the Jews College and in Oxford, and he finally got a job in America before the war. He was a very important Rav in America, Sephardic rabbi. He was a very important Sephardic rabbi in America during World War II. He was English speaking. He was extremely smart, very highly educated, and he was a very big representative of Jewish causes, especially Sephardi Jewish causes before and after the war. His his PhD dissertation was written about the Kaddish. Until this day, it's one of the best pieces of research. A lot of research has been done since, and a lot of the nuances. If you're an academic yourself, you'll notice some of the nuances in the Kaddish research he did in 1909 is a little bit dated, but for the most part, it's one of the best works on Kaddish till today. You could buy it on Amazon for $15. It's called The Kaddish by David D. Solapool. Now, he does a lot of excellent work in trying to reverse engineer the language of the Kaddish and to find if we could look at the actual language itself and trace back what exactly when exactly it was composed. So if you think about that, the Kaddish is written in Aramaic, but as we have seen, some of the Braitot, some of the Midrashim say Yehei Shemo Hagadol Mevarach, right? Some say Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevarach. Some of them put it in Aramaic, some of it put it in Hebrew. So the question is, was it originally in Hebrew? Was it originally in Aramaic? Most scholars assume when it comes to prayer and liturgy that when you have two forms of something, let's say Kol Nidre and Kol Nidarim, right? Usually the Aramaic form is earlier because that was written in the vernacular of the people, and the Hebrew version was written later as a new version, a more correct version, an adaptation of the original vernacular that the people spoke. So most scholars assume that Kaddish was originally in a form of Aramaic, but Rabbi Poole is very good at ancient languages, and he does quite a good analysis. And I won't bore you with the details of the Aramaic, but he does an excellent analysis of the Aramaic in Kaddish. And his conclusion is that this is not spoken Aramaic. This is yeshivish Aramaic. Just like today, you have English, right? You have yeshivish English, where you go to somebody in Lakewood and he's going to talk to you in words you don't understand if you're a guy, right? He's going to say avada, I'll do this, and epis azad. Like the way people speak, if they speak yeshivish English, is hilarious. So too in the time of the Jews of the Gemara, they had both the colloquial, the common folk speaking of Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, a precise, proper Aramaic spoken by the Jews of the Sassanid Empire, and they also had a more yeshivish version, like a rabbinic version of Aramaic. So there's like like the way the Gemara says Hada Amri Inchi versus the way the Gemara will say Hada Amri Rabbanan. Right, this is an expression of the people versus this is an expression of the rabbis. There's just really two different modes of speaking. But he believes, and this is critical, he believes that the Aramaic version and the hybrid version, which has Hebrew inside of it, because the Kaddish that we have today is a mix of Hebrew and Aramaic, he believes that the hybrid version is actually the original, which is a fascinating idea. Now, even if the hybrid version is the original, does this help us trace back as to how early back it could go? No, because the Aramaic resembles the Targum, the early Targum forms of Aramaic, and those can go all the way back from 400 years before the Khurban to 400 years, 500 years after the Khurban. The Aramaic is an ancient language with thousands of years of dialects, thousands of years of evolution. So the actual rabbinic Aramaic of it doesn't help us precisely date it. However, he feels that the form of the Kaddish and the contents of it points to the types of notions and messianic ideas that were prevalent among Jews in the first century and possibly a little bit earlier. So especially with parallels from the Christian Paternoster, there's a lot of parallels to prayers in the New Testament. So he uses that data to estimate that the Kaddish existed before the Khurban Bayit Sheni. Now, this is not conclusive evidence, but that's his suspicion. Now, one of the most interesting things about the Kaddish, the terms that we find in the Kaddish is the term Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevrach La'olam U'mei Maya, or Yitkadal B'Yitkadash Shmei Rabba, because the terms there of let me show you this comparison here on my screen because it's very interesting to see it inside. Oops. The term Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevrach La'olam U'mei Maya essentially is the Aramaic translation of the words in either Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Va'ed or Yehei Shem Hashem Mevrach Yehei Shmo Hagadol Mevrach La'olam U'mei Maya. I forgot the pasuk in Tehillim. Yehei Shem Hashem Mevrach Me'ata V'ad Olam. Right, so it's Yehei Shem Hashem Mevrach Me'ata V'ad Olam. In translated would be Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevrach La'olam U'mei Maya. That's essentially the translation. And similarly, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Vaed is more or less Yehei Shmei Hagadol Mevarach L'Olam Umei Maya. So that expression of Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Vaed as a response to Kriya Shema. I'm sorry if I've lost you. Let me just repeat again. One more early. What I'm trying to do is, and I'm sorry if I'm a little backwards here. What we're going to do now is we just said that it's probably as early as the first century. The Aramaic takes us back to a rabbinic form of Aramaic. Fine. Now, an extra early source, besides all the Gemaras and besides all the Midrashim, one of the earliest sources for it is a Targum on Chumash. And the Targum is mentioning the pasuk of Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Vaed, and we're going to have to read this Targum together. This Targum, let me share my screen with you because you have to see this inside. This Targum is a Targum you've probably never heard of. It's called the Targum Neophiti. The Targum Neophiti is a Targum which was first published in the 16th century by an a Jewish convert to Christianity who brought this copy of the Targum Yerushalmi to the church. And this Jewish convert, I forgot his name, something Desante. This Christian convert brought a codex, a book, and I'm showing this to you on the screen. This codex, he presented it to Pope Gregory VIII. Pope Gregory VIII is the famous guy who made the Gregorian calendar. So he gave this book of the Targum Yerushalmi, so to speak, to the church, and it got censored, etc. The point is that they thought it was the regular the Targum Yerushalmi that we all have. However, it wasn't. It was not near Targum Onkelos. It was not near Targum Yerushalmi. It was really its own Targum. And as far as Targums go, I've discussed this in other classes. Targums are an ancient translation of the Torah. So the interesting thing about this Targum is that it gives us a new version of the Targum Yerushalmi that we're familiar with from the end of Vayechi. At the end of Vayechi, it says that Yaakov Avinu brought his sons to give them all a bracha. And the Targum Yerushalmi there adds a whole extra elaboration. It's very typical for the Targum Yerushalmi, which is a Western dialect of Aramaic, that when it does the Tirgum, it also adds Midrash. It also adds lots of stories, because when they did the Targum and when they read the Torah on the shul, they would also translate it. And the Western branches of Judaism would all translate it with embellishments when they had the time. So those Targumim got more embellished. But if you look at the earliest versions of those Targumim, typically they have less embellishments because the Ur text, the original text of that Western Targum is more preserved, and only later copies had the extra embellishments. So the Targum Neophiti is essentially the Targum Yerushalmi that we have, but with a few extra things and a few skeletal things, which make it appear as if it's the original. This is the original Targum HaYerushalmi. So it's a fascinating Targum to get your eyes on. You won't find it in Sefaria.org, but you could find it on alhatorah.org if you're trying to look. And of course, I think this is not the Bodleian, but I could find you the website later. The whole thing is digitized on trying to remember what website this is, but I'll find it's the Biblioteca Apostolica. What website is this? Maybe it's the Vatican's website. Regardless. Okay, that's Gregory VIII for all that it's worth. So let me discuss this Targum, this Targum Neophiti. The pasuk says that Yaakov Avinu brought his sons to give them a bracha. The Targum tells us a story. It says Yaakov Avinu brought them to the bed, and they all surrounded his golden bed. And Yaakov Avinu was struck by a feeling of doom. He felt like, wait a second. Avram Avinu had Ishmael come out of him. Yitzchak Avinu, my father, had Esav come out of him. Maybe I am going to have a Shevet, which is going to be bad. So he said to them, how do I know that none of you are perhaps straying towards idol worship? So the Targum says that when he didn't accuse, but when he asked this of his sons, like, how do I know none of you are going to stray from God? They all responded together, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. No, we only believe in one God. And it says it in Aramaic, V'amnin Shema Minan Yisrael Avinu Hashem Elokana Hashem Chad. And what does Yaakov Avinu respond in the Targum Yerushalmi? says, Ani Yaakov Avunan ve'amari, Hey Shmei Rabba mevarach la'olam olmaya. But the Targum Neofiti, which is even earlier than the Targum Yerushalmi, says, Baruch Shemei Kvodei D'Malchutei Le'almei Almin, which literally is a translation of Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. So we see that the earliest forms of Kaddish might have been a reworking of the words of Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, and they might have been related somehow to Shema Yisrael. We just don't know how. The one thing we do know is that this Targum is very early. It might be from the earliest eras of the Tanaim, and therefore it's tantalizing to think of what Kaddish might have been at the time. Once more, there is no Gemara which mentions Kaddish by its name. There is no Gemara that speaks about Kaddish as a requirement of Tefillah. Therefore, we don't have any evidence that Kaddish was used as a liturgical element during the time of the Gemara. We don't have any evidence that in Talmudic times of the Amoraim, they were using Kaddish during davening. The only evidence that we have is that they would say some form of nechamata, some form of dismissal prayer after the prayers, after the study period, and then that prayer had the words in it, Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevarach, but most people assume that that is referring to some form of Kaddish as we know it. Now, in the time of the Gaonim, both the early Gaonim and the later Gaonim, we already see that it's set as standard that Kaddish is a part of the liturgy. It's no longer relegated just to the study hall. It's also a part of the prayers proper. We see this in Masechet Sofrim, which is written between the 6th and the 8th centuries in Eretz Yisrael. And we also see this in the Seder of Amram, where we see that this was used liturgically to precede Baruch Hu. Right before the Baruch Hu is Hashem Avorach, they would say a Kaddish. Now, there's a professor named Professor Yisrael Tashema. Professor Tashema did some incredible reverse engineering work using a lot of the data we have from the time of the Gaonim. And he makes a very interesting argument that the Kaddish itself was only added to the liturgy in Gaonic times to accompany Baruch Hu, meaning it was an introduction to the words Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMevorach. For some reason, Kaddish, because it's Yehei Shmei HaGadol, because it's a blessing which is supposed to magnify the greatness of God's name, therefore, as an introduction to the words of Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMevorach, they took this nechamata that everybody loved from the study hall, which this nechamata speaks about how God's name should be great, and they used it as an introduction to the words Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMevorach. Baruch Hu es Hashem HaMevorach is really like a zimun. It's a zimun that you're doing, an invitation to everybody to start Yotzer. Therefore, because they wanted to be mezamin everybody to start Yotzer, with an introduction, they used the introduction of Kaddish. This is his theory. It's a fascinating reverse engineering. For example, one of the most interesting things he mentions is that in the time of the Gaonim, it's clear from Masechet Sofrim, they would start Shachrit, Mincha, and Arvit with Kaddish and Baruch Hu, even by Mincha. And the minhag was after, I believe it was after Geula, after the Geula of Shachrit and Arvit, after Seder Baruch Hashem Gal Yisrael, they would do Kaddish again with Baruch Hu in case anybody came late. This was the ancient minhag, which shows you that Kaddish and Baruch Hu in their times was considered one unit. When you were going to use Kaddish in the liturgy in Gaonic times, it was considered as one unit with Baruch Hu because Kaddish was only brought into the liturgy for Baruch Hu. That's how it got into the liturgy, because it's a borrowed nechamata for the Siddur, which is a fascinating theory, which would mean that only in the time of the Rishonim do we have this question. The Rishonim say, wait, what is Kaddish actually for? And the Rishonim have all sorts of different answers. Well, maybe Kaddish is something we say after Psukim. Maybe Kaddish is a bridge between two sections of Tefillah. But in his view, no, the Balei Tosfos were right. And the view of the Rishonim and the Balei Tosfos was in Brachot Daf Gimel, they hold the original Kaddish was written for the study hall. It only got transplanted to the liturgy, to the Siddur later. How did that happen? The Tosafot don't know. But what Professor Tashema is trying to explain is that based on the sources we have in the time of the Gaonim, and I won't bore you with every single one right now, but based on those sources, it seems that it came to accompany an introduction for the Baruch Hu. Only later did we have more and more evolutions of the Kaddish, which turned into Kaddish Yatom, Kaddish Yehei Shlamar Rabbah, Chatzi Kaddish, and all of these various inventions, which got tacked on later in the time of the early Rishonim. Now, I'm sure everybody's thinking, how about Kaddish Yatom? How in the world did Kaddish become associated with the dead? The Kaddish speaks nothing of dead people. It has no. All it's talking about is how God's name should be glorified and how Mashiach should come. It doesn't speak about Kaddish. So why in the world do people say Kaddish for dead people? Where does Kaddish Yatom come from? Now, next week, God willing, we're going to delve into that because this is really a medieval story more than it is an ancient story. Tonight, we're going to study the ancient. We're studying the ancient history of Kaddish. But for tonight's purposes, what I'll leave you with is a tshuva which very few people know about. And this is a tshuva from Reb Kleinus bar Kleinus. So Kleinus bar Kleinus was one of the early Rishonim, one of the Gaonic era rabbis, one of the rabbis from the 9th century, who was a rabbi in northern Italy, in Lombardy. In Rome and Lombard. And Rabbi Kleinus bar Kleinus, it appears, was trained not in the schools of Eretz Yisrael, not in the Gaonic yeshivas of Eretz Yisrael, but he was trained in the Gaonic yeshivas of Bavel. So he traveled from Italy all the way to Baghdad to learn Torah and all the way back to Italy. This is at least the suspicion of historians, but we don't know precisely. One of the few chuvos we have from him is a tshuva about whether or not you could say Kaddish by a graveside. It says Kaddish b'shura. This minhag of saying Kaddish by the graveside right before they depart the graveside, bein omim sidu kadin, bein lo omim sidu kadin. Whether or not they say the pesukim of sidu kadin or not, Yafehu, it's a nice thing. Ve'eni sur bekach, and it's not a sur. Va'afilu ha'avadim ksherim. Even if you have a servant who was a righteous person, like a servant, I assume he means a goy, but perhaps he also means a Jewish person. But even if you have a goyish servant who you're burying, shemishamrim et hamuna, who follow the laws of Hashem, omrim kaddish, you could say kaddish for such a person. V'kach katvu mimisifta, and this is what they paskin from the yeshiva. Fascinating thing. So we see that the earliest history we have of the Kaddish being associated with the dead is most likely the Kaddish that was said by a graveside because they were accompanying the Tziduk Hadin. Now, it's not clear which Kaddish they were saying. Were they saying the Kaddish Dirabanan? Were they saying the Kaddish of Kaddish Hagadol, which has La Chaya Meitaya? But we're ending here the shiurim in the class, so we're gonna have to end the shiur. Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll continue with more of the history of the Kaddish Yatom and how that developed into the mourners Kaddish and how it became associated Lachei Meitaya much more with the departed and connecting people to those who they lost. Let me see if there's anything else we have to cover. No, I'm sorry, we're about to do the Kaddish Drabanan here in our shul, so I'm going to have to end the recording now. So thank everybody for your time and attention. Bezrat Hashem, we will continue next week. Let me stop the recording.